They say you never know someone's true character until you push them too far. But the 7 leather-clad bikers at Johnson's Hardware never expected their afternoon of intimidation to end with their cherished motorcycles crushed beneath a forklift, and their leader learning a harsh lesson about respecting combat veterans. By the time the dust settled that spring morning, the man they mockingly called Old Timer had demonstrated why 22 years as a Marine Corps Force Recon operator was about to become their worst nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Reeves stood in aisle 7 of Johnson's Hardware, his calloused hands examining an impact driver as early morning sunlight filtered through the store's dusty windows. 22 years of military service had taught him to appreciate quality tools, and something about the weight of this one felt off. At 52, his hair might have gone gray at the temples, but his arms still carried the strength earned through countless missions in places most Americans couldn't pronounce. The familiar scent of sawdust and metal brought back memories of weekends spent in his father's workshop, learning lessons about craftsmanship and patience that would later save his life in combat. Now, 3 months into retirement, he was finally building the custom furniture business he'd always dreamed about. If only his father could see him now. The bell above the store's entrance chimed, but it was the sudden silence that followed that caught Marcus's attention. Years of combat had honed his situational awareness to a razor's edge, and right now, every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The usual morning chatter of contractors and DIY enthusiasts had gone quiet, replaced by the heavy footfalls of multiple boots and the subtle jingling of chain wallets. Through the gap between shelving units, Marcus watched as 7 men in leather vests swaggered down the main aisle. Their patches identified them as members of the Iron Serpents, a motorcycle gang that had been making headlines lately for all the wrong reasons. Their leader, a giant of a man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, stopped at the counter where old Bill Johnson stood nervously adjusting his glasses. "Quite a nice place you got here," the gang leader drawled, running a finger through the dust on the counter. "Shame if anything were to happen to it. But you know, for a reasonable monthly fee, we could make sure it stays protected." Marcus's jaw tightened as he watched Bill's hands tremble. He'd known the hardware store owner for just 3 months, but in that time, the old man had gone out of his way to help Marcus source specialty tools for his new business, even staying late to receive special orders. More than that, Bill had given Marcus's nephew Tommy a part-time job when the boy needed direction after his father's deployment overseas. The sound of breaking glass pulled Marcus's attention back to the counter, where one of the bikers had accidentally knocked over a display of light bulbs. "Oops," the man sneered, grinding the glass under his boot. "Guess you should have had better protection." 2 decades of combat experience had taught Marcus Reeves when a situation was about to escalate from bad to worse. As he set down the impact driver and moved silently toward the front of the store, he knew this wasn't just about standing up to bullies. It was about protecting good people who couldn't protect themselves. And if these Iron Serpents wanted to learn about real power, well, he'd earned his combat experience the hard way. They were about to learn that some old Marines never lose their bite. Marcus moved with the fluid grace that came from years of close-quarters combat training, each step calculated and silent despite the creaky floorboards. Through the gaps in the shelving, he could see 3 more bikers spreading out through the store, their leather vests bearing patches that read Iron Serpents above a coiled snake preparing to strike. The irony wasn't lost on him. In the Corps, he'd been known for striking fast and without warning. "I don't have that kind of money," Bill Johnson's voice trembled, but there was a hint of defiance in it. "Business has been slow since the big box store opened on the highway." The snake-tattooed leader leaned forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the old man. "That's funny because I heard you just got a big contract supplying tools to that new housing development on Oak Ridge." He traced a finger along the counter's edge. "Be a shame if their deliveries started going missing." Marcus's mind rapidly assessed the situation, just as he'd done countless times in combat. 7 hostiles, civilians present. He'd counted 3 other customers who were trying their best to become invisible. 2 exits, main entrance and the loading dock in back. security cameras in the corners, though he doubted these thugs cared about being recorded. The smallest biker, a wiry man with a patchy beard, knocked over a display of hammers, sending them clattering across the floor. "Oops," he cackled. "Guess you'll need some of that protection money to replace these too." "That's enough." Marcus's voice cut through the tension like a combat knife. He stepped out from behind the shelving, positioning himself where he could see all 7 bikers while keeping his back away from any blind spots. "I believe Mr. Johnson made his position clear." The leader turned slowly, sizing up Marcus with eyes that had clearly evaluated potential threats before. "Well, look what we got here. Some old-timer trying to play hero." He gestured to his crew, who began to form a loose semicircle. "This ain't your business, Pops. Why don't you go back to shopping for your little DIY project before you get hurt?" "Actually, it is my business." Marcus's voice remained calm, the same tone he'd used to diffuse situations in war zones across 3 continents. "See, Mr. Johnson here is a friend, and in the Marines we have a saying about friends: no one gets left behind." The leader's eyes narrowed at the mention of the Marines. Marcus saw the slight shift in his stance, the subtle reevaluation. Good. At least he wasn't completely stupid. "Marines, huh?" The leader cracked his knuckles. "I did some time in county with an ex-Marine. Wasn't so tough after a few rounds in the yard." "Former Marine," Marcus corrected him. "There are no ex-Marines, and I suspect your jail yard friend wasn't Force Recon." He took one step forward, measured and deliberate. "Last chance to walk away. Take your protection racket somewhere else." The wiry biker with the patchy beard pulled out a switchblade, its click echoing through the suddenly silent store. "Boss, this old man needs to learn some respect." Marcus sighed internally. They always had to learn the hard way. His eyes tracked minute details: weight distributions, nervous tics, the subtle tells that separated true fighters from thugs who relied on intimidation. The leader was the only real threat. The others were followers who'd probably never faced serious resistance. "You know what your problem is, old-timer?" The leader stepped forward, using his bulk to loom over Marcus. "You've been watching too many action movies. This ain't some Hollywood setup where the old vet teaches the bad guys a lesson. This is real life, and in real life, numbers win." "Numbers?" Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "In Force Recon, we specialized in being outnumbered. The difference is, we were trained to handle it." His eyes locked onto the leader's. "How's your training, son?" The leader's face darkened at being called son. Behind him, Bill Johnson was slowly reaching under the counter, probably for the shotgun Marcus knew he kept there. "Mr. Johnson," Marcus called out, not taking his eyes off the bikers, "I'd appreciate if you didn't get that shotgun involved. Things are about to get messy enough without firearms." The look of surprise on the bikers' faces at his awareness of the shotgun was almost comical. Almost. "Last chance," Marcus said quietly. "Walk away. Come back tomorrow when you've had time to think about whether this is really how you want your day to go." The leader's response was to shove a shelf of paint cans toward Marcus. Kill this old fool. What happened next would become legend in 3 counties. Marcus moved before the first paint can hit the floor. 22 years of combat training took over, his body responding with the fluid efficiency that had kept him alive through 3 wars. The leader's wild swing passed through empty air as Marcus stepped inside his guard, using the bigger man's momentum against him. A precise strike to the solar plexus doubled the gang leader over, followed by an elbow to the back of his neck that sent him sprawling into his own men. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Boss!" The wiry biker with the switchblade lunged forward, blade glinting under the fluorescent lights. Marcus caught his wrist with practiced ease, twisting sharply. The knife clattered to the floor along with its owner, who howled in pain as his shoulder dislocated with a sickening pop. 2 more bikers charged simultaneously, trying to flank him. Marcus had trained for exactly this scenario countless times in combat courses. He moved between them, letting their own rushed attacks cause them to collide. A quick series of strikes to vulnerable pressure points left them gasping on the floor, their bodies remembering lessons they'd never actually learned about hand-to-hand combat. "Stop!" The leader had regained his feet, blood trickling from his nose. "Nobody moves like that. Who the hell are you?" "Master Sergeant Marcus Reeves," he replied calmly, shifting his stance to keep the remaining bikers in view. "Force Recon, retired, though right now, I'm just a guy trying to buy some power tools." The three standing bikers exchanged nervous glances. Their usual tactics of intimidation had dissolved in the face of real combat experience. Through the store's front windows, Marcus could see their motorcycles parked haphazardly across the handicap spaces, another sign of their disregard for others. "You're dead, old man," the leader snarled, pulling brass knuckles from his vest pocket. "I don't care what kind of special forces tricks you know. We own this town. After we're done with you, we're burning this place to the ground." Marcus's expression hardened. "That's the difference between bullies and Marines. You threaten to burn things down. We prevent it." He gestured to the security cameras. "By the way, how do you think those threats will play in court?" The leader charged forward, brass knuckles gleaming. But Marcus had fought stronger, faster, better-trained men in combat. He sidestepped the wild swing, grabbed the leader's arm, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into a display of PVC pipes. The pipes cascaded down, momentarily trapping the bigger man. The remaining bikers finally showed some tactical sense, trying to surround Marcus in a triangle formation. But the narrow aisles of the hardware store worked against them, limiting their mobility. Marcus used the environment to his advantage, just as he'd been trained. A kick sent a rolling toolbox into one biker's legs, while a well-aimed paint can took another in the chest. "The Marines taught me something important," Marcus announced to the groaning men. "It's not about how hard you can hit. It's about controlling the battlefield." He picked up the fallen switchblade, examining it before tossing it into a trash can. "Right now, your battlefield is my terrain." The leader emerged from the pile of PVC pipes, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. "You think this changes anything? We're the Iron Serpents. We've got chapters in 3 states. You just signed your own death warrant." Marcus's laugh held no humor. "Son, I've had death warrants signed by better men than you in places a lot scarier than a hardware store." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Now here's what's going to happen. The police are about to receive videos of your attempted extortion and assault. Those security cameras Mr. Johnson installed last month, they upload directly to the cloud." As if on cue, police sirens wailed in the distance. "You've got about 2 minutes to decide," Marcus continued. "You can either be here when the cops arrive trying to explain why 7 grown men attacked a retired Marine in a hardware store, or you can leave. But know this, if you ever come back, if you ever threaten Mr. Johnson or anyone else in this town again, what happened today will seem like a warm-up." The leader's face contorted with rage, but fear had replaced the arrogance in his eyes. "This isn't over." "Actually," Marcus replied, "it is. That's another thing the Marines taught me, how to finish a fight decisively." He turned to Bill Johnson, who stood wide-eyed behind the counter. "Mr. Johnson, I believe you were about to show me that new line of impact drivers?" The bikers retreated, helping their injured companions stumble toward the exit. The bell chimed 7 times as they left, a stark contrast to their intimidating entrance just minutes before. Through the window, Marcus watched them mount their motorcycles, their movements hampered by their various injuries. As the police cars rounded the corner, Marcus turned to find Bill Johnson offering him the impact driver he'd been examining earlier. "It's on the house," the old man said, his voice thick with emotion. "Least I can do." Marcus smiled, reaching for his wallet. "Thanks, but I'll pay full price. Marines believe in fair deals." He paused. "Though I wouldn't mind a discount on some lumber. I've got a few projects in mind." Outside, the sound of motorcycles faded into the distance, replaced by the approaching sirens. Marcus knew this wasn't truly over. Bullies rarely learned their lessons easily. But as he watched Bill Johnson straighten his shoulders and begin picking up the scattered tools, he knew he'd made the right choice. Sometimes the best way to honor your service wasn't in the memories of past battles, but in the willingness to stand up for what's right in the present. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements and cleanup. Marcus helped Bill Johnson restore order to the aisles, while officers Ramirez and Chen took detailed notes about the incident. The younger cop Chen couldn't hide her admiration as she reviewed the security footage on her tablet. "Master Sergeant," Officer Chen whistled, "that was some impressive work. Haven't seen moves like that since my brother's MMA tournaments." "Just muscle memory, ma'am," Marcus replied, straightening a shelf of drill bits. "Though I suspect our friends won't appreciate being on camera." He noticed Officer Ramirez's concerned expression. "Something on your mind, officer?" Ramirez glanced around before lowering his voice. "The Iron Serpents. They're not just some local troublemakers. Past few months, they've been expanding across the county. Several business owners have reported similar protection offers, but nobody's willing to press charges." "Fear's their weapon," Marcus observed, remembering similar tactics used by insurgents overseas. "People stay quiet, they get bolder." Bill Johnson joined them, his glasses still slightly askew from the confrontation. "Marcus, maybe we should just let this go. File it as a misunderstanding. These people, they've got connections." "That's what they want you to believe, Mr. Johnson." Marcus's voice carried the quiet authority that had steadied young Marines in combat zones. "Bullies rely on isolation. They want each victim to feel alone." A commotion outside drew their attention. Tommy, Bill's young employee and Marcus's nephew, rushed in, his face flushed with excitement. "Uncle Marcus, you've got to see this. The whole town's talking about what happened. Someone posted a clip from the security cameras online." Marcus followed Tommy outside, where a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop next door was showing everyone a video on her phone. Shaky footage of Marcus's encounter with the bikers, already gaining views on social media. "That's going to complicate things," Officer Ramirez muttered. "Actually," Marcus smiled, "it might be exactly what we need." He turned to Bill Johnson. "How many other business owners have they threatened?" "At least a dozen that I know of," Bill replied. "The cafe down the street, the auto parts store on 5th, even the new yoga studio. But nobody talks about it openly." Marcus nodded, a plan forming in his mind. 22 years in Force Recon had taught him that the best defense was often a coordinated response. "Officer Chen, that footage might help convince others to come forward. Sometimes people just need to know they're not alone. And sometimes," a new voice added, "people need a reminder of what this town used to be." Marcus turned to find Mike Sullivan, owner of the local diner and a fellow veteran, walking up with purpose in his stride. "Sergeant Reeves, that was some fine work in there. Reminds me of the old days when this was a peaceful community." "Still can be, Mr. Sullivan," Marcus replied, "if people stand together. That's why I'm here." Sullivan's face was grim. "Just got word. The Iron Serpents are holding a meeting at their clubhouse outside town. Word is their state president's flying in. They're not going to let this embarrassment slide." Officer Ramirez shifted uncomfortably. "We should increase patrols, but honestly, our hands are tied without more witnesses willing to come forward." "Then let's get them to come forward," Marcus said firmly. He turned to the gathered crowd. "How many of you are tired of living in fear? How many have seen these thugs threaten your neighbors, your friends?" A murmur ran through the group. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her small frame straight with determination. "They broke my delivery van's windows last month, said it was a warning for not paying their protection fee." "They threatened my son," another voice called out. Marcus recognized Jim Peterson from the auto parts store. "Said they'd make sure he had an accident at college if I didn't play ball." More stories emerged, each one painting a picture of systematic intimidation. Marcus listened, his tactical mind analyzing patterns, weaknesses, points of vulnerability. The Iron Serpents had been clever, keeping each incident isolated, making each victim feel alone. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd pushed too far in a town with a stronger spirit than they realized. "Here's what we're going to do," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the natural command presence that had served him well in the Corps. "First, Everyone who's been threatened files a police report. Officer Chen, I trust you can handle that? The young officer nodded eagerly. Every report strengthens our case. Second, Marcus continued, we form a business owners association. Strength in numbers. Mr. Sullivan, would you help coordinate? Already on it, Sullivan grinned. Got a list of people ready to join. And third, Marcus's eyes hardened, we let the Iron Serpents know that this town isn't their playground anymore. They want to escalate? Fine. But they're about to learn what happens when they take on a community instead of isolated victims. As the crowd dispersed with renewed purpose, Bill Johnson touched Marcus's arm. You know they'll come after you. First, right? These aren't the kind of people who forget. Marcus smiled grimly. That's counting on it, Mr. Johnson. In the Marines, we had a saying, the best way to disarm a snake is to let it strike where you want it to. What none of them realized was that the real battle was just beginning. And Marcus Reeves was about to teach the Iron Serpents a lesson about the difference between intimidating civilians and facing a Marine who'd never forgotten his oath to protect others. The Iron Serpents' response came faster than Marcus expected. By nightfall, their clubhouse on the outskirts of town had become a hive of activity. Through his tactical binoculars, Marcus counted at least 30 motorcycles parked outside the converted warehouse. They were calling in reinforcements, exactly as he'd anticipated. That's a lot of muscle, Officer Chen commented from her patrol car, parked discreetly down the street from Marcus's position. She'd been monitoring the situation unofficially, her conscience winning over department politics. Our chief won't authorize any action without more evidence, says his hands are tied. More like greased, Marcus replied, noting how expensive cars kept arriving at the clubhouse. Those aren't typical biker vehicles. They're bringing in their legitimate business partners, the ones who help them appear respectable. His phone buzzed with a text from Mike Sullivan. Meeting set. 20 business owners. Tonight. Back room of my diner. They're scared, but they're coming. Marcus had spent enough time in combat zones to recognize the calm before a storm. The Iron Serpents were planning something big, a show of force designed to crush this rebellion before it spread. But they were using an old playbook, one he'd seen terrorists and insurgents use countless times. As he drove to Sullivan's diner, Marcus noticed the subtle signs of intimidation already in play. 2 motorcycles followed him at a distance, their riders making no attempt to hide their surveillance. A black SUV with tinted windows was parked outside Bill Johnson's hardware store. Classic psychological warfare, letting your opponent know they're being watched. The diner's closed sign was lit, but the back parking lot was full. Marcus entered through the kitchen, nodding to Sullivan, who stood guard at the door. Inside the back room, the tension was palpable. 20 of the town's business owners sat around hastily arranged tables, their faces showing a mix of fear and determination. Thank you all for coming, Marcus began, his voice carrying the calm authority that had steadied young Marines before combat operations. I know being here puts you at risk, but staying silent is an even bigger risk. Mrs. Chen spoke up first, her normally cheerful face set with resolve. They came to my shop this afternoon, said they'd burn it down with me inside if I filed a police report about my van. Similar stories emerged. The Iron Serpents had been busy visiting every business owner who might pose a threat to their operations. Their message was clear: resist and face destruction. They're scared, Marcus explained, pacing the room like he was briefing troops. What happened at the hardware store showed their weakness. When faced with real resistance, they crumbled. Now they're trying to regain control through fear. But they're not just thugs, Jim Peterson interjected. My cousin works at the county clerk's office, says they've got legitimate businesses, political connections. We're not just fighting street criminals. No, Marcus agreed. We're fighting corruption. But corruption has a weakness. It can't survive in the light. He pulled out a stack of documents. These are sworn statements from business owners in other towns where the Iron Serpents operate. Evidence of their protection rackets, their legitimate fronts, their political payoffs. Officer Chen helped collect them. The young police officer stepped forward. There's a state task force building a case against them, but they need witnesses willing to testify. "That's suicide," someone called out. "That's what they want you to think," Marcus countered. "But here's what they don't want you to know. Their whole operation depends on isolation, on making each victim feel alone and helpless. Together, with documented evidence and coordinated testimony, we can bring them down." Sullivan cleared his throat. "Marcus, we've got movement. Their scouts just pulled up outside." Through the diner's windows, Marcus could see 3 motorcycles circling the parking lot, their riders taking photos with their phones. Another intimidation tactic, documenting who attended the meeting. "Let them look," Marcus declared. "In fact, let's give them something to see." He turned to the group. "Tomorrow at noon, we're all going to meet in front of the courthouse, in broad daylight, with press present. Every business owner who's been threatened, every citizen who's been intimidated. We're going to show them that we're not hiding anymore." "They'll retaliate," Bill Johnson warned. "They'll try," Marcus corrected. "But they can't target everyone at once, and this time, we'll be ready. Officer Chen has surveillance teams in place. Every threat, every act of intimidation will be documented. We're not just filing police reports, we're building a RICO case." A murmur of hope rippled through the room. Marcus could see the change in their faces, the same transformation he'd witnessed in young Marines who'd finally found their courage under fire. "One more thing," he added, his voice hardening. "They're going to come after me first. Hard. When they do, I want your word that you won't back down. No matter what happens, you stand together. Because that's how we win. Not through violence, but through unity they can't break." As the meeting dispersed, with business owners leaving in small groups to avoid attention, Sullivan pulled Marcus aside. "Just like old times, eh? Planning operations, coordinating resistance." "With one difference," Marcus smiled grimly. "This time we're fighting for our own home." Outside, the motorcycles still circled, their engines a distant growl of impotent threat. But Marcus knew the real battle was about to begin. The Iron Serpents would strike back hard, trying to crush this rebellion before it spread. They were about to learn that some targets bite back, and a Marine who'd sworn to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic, never breaks that oath, even in retirement. The Iron Serpent's retaliation began at dawn. Marcus woke to the sound of breaking glass, a brick through his front window, wrapped in a note that read, "First warning." 22 years of combat experience had taught him to expect such moves, which was why he'd positioned motion-activated cameras around his property the night before. His phone buzzed with urgent messages. The Iron Serpents had been busy. Mrs. Chen's flower shop vandalized, Sullivan's diner's windows smashed, Bill Johnson's hardware store's locks superglued shut. But their coordinated attack had one fatal flaw. It was all caught on camera, just as Marcus had planned. They hit everyone who attended the meeting, Officer Chen reported, standing in Marcus's living room as crime scene technicians photographed the brick. But something's different. These aren't just local members. The surveillance photos show faces we don't recognize. Their state leadership's making a statement, Marcus observed, reviewing the footage on his tablet. Bringing in outsiders for deniability. Classic insurgent tactic. We saw it in every war zone I served in. His doorbell rang. On his porch stood Mike Sullivan, sporting a fresh black eye, and Bill Johnson, whose hands trembled less than they had the day before. "They're trying to scare people away from the courthouse meeting," Sullivan reported grimly. "Some are wavering, but most are still in. Your Marine speech about standing together really got through." Marcus nodded, studying the brick that had come through his window. "They're escalating faster than expected. Means we rattled them. But this is just the beginning. They'll have something planned for the courthouse." His phone rang. Jim Peterson from the auto parts store. "Marcus, you need to see this. They're at my store right now, but something's not right." 20 minutes later, Marcus stood across the street from Peterson's Auto Parts, watching as a team of health and safety inspectors conducted a surprise inspection. The Iron Serpents were nowhere in sight, but their hand was obvious. The inspectors arrived in expensive cars, their badges looking just a little too new. They're using legitimate channels, Officer Chen murmured, watching through binoculars. Health inspections, fire code violations, surprise tax audits, all the businesses from last night's meeting are getting hit. Smart play, Marcus admitted. Hard to fight back against official channels. He paused, a plan forming. Unless... He pulled out his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Martinez speaking. Carlos, it's Marcus Reeves. Remember that favor you owe me from Fallujah? There was a pause. The one where you carried me 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in my leg? Yeah, that's not the kind of thing you forget. What do you need? You still working for the Federal Task Force on Organized Crime? Deputy Director now, why? Marcus smiled grimly. How'd you like to help me spring a trap on a motorcycle gang that's branching into corruption of public officials? The courthouse meeting was scheduled for noon, but Marcus had people in position by 10. Mrs. Chen's teenage sons positioned themselves on nearby rooftops with cameras. Sullivan's veterans group members mingled casually in the crowd, looking like ordinary citizens but ready for trouble. Officer Chen had convinced 3 honest cops to provide security, positioned strategically around the plaza. By 11:30, the Iron Serpents made their presence known. Motorcycles roared through the streets, circling the courthouse like vultures. Black SUVs with tinted windows parked at strategic corners. Local news crews arrived, drawn by anonymous tips about potential trouble. Right on schedule, Marcus murmured, watching from the courthouse steps as the crowd began to gather. Despite the intimidation, people were coming, not just the business owners from last night's meeting, but their families, their employees, their neighbors. The Iron Serpents had made a critical mistake. Their campaign of fear had united the community instead of dividing it. The gang's leadership arrived at 11:50, led by a man Marcus recognized from intelligence photos as Victor the Judge Rodriguez, the state president. Unlike his thuggish underlings, Rodriguez wore an expensive suit and carried a leather briefcase. He looked more like a corrupted lawyer than a biker gang leader, which made him all the more dangerous. Quite a crowd you've gathered, Sergeant Reeves, Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone used to manipulating systems. Shame if anything unfortunate were to happen. Crowds can be so unpredictable. Marcus stepped forward, pitching his voice to carry across the plaza. You know what else is unpredictable? Federal investigations into corruption of public officials. Rodriguez's smile flickered slightly. Behind him, his enforcers shifted uneasily as unmarked vehicles began pulling up, disgorging serious-looking men and women in tactical gear. The trap was sprung. Now they just had to survive the bite of a cornered snake. Rodriguez's composed facade cracked as federal agents emerged from their vehicles, their badges glinting in the midday sun. The Iron Serpent's enforcers instinctively moved closer to their leader, leather vests creaking with tension. But Marcus noticed something more telling. The way local officials who had been approaching the courthouse suddenly turned and walked away, phone to their ears, no doubt trying to distance themselves from what was about to unfold. What's the matter, Judge? Marcus called out, using the gang leader's street name with deliberate irony. Looks like some of your friends in high places are suddenly busy elsewhere. You have no idea what you're starting, Reeves, Rodriguez snarled, his cultured voice giving way to something harder, more desperate. This isn't just about some small-town protection racket. Oh, I know exactly what this is about, Marcus replied, nodding to Carlos Martinez as his old war buddy approached, federal badge displayed. It's about corruption, money laundering, RICO violations. Did you really think those health inspectors you sent this morning wouldn't be traced back to your shell companies? The crowd had grown larger, phones recording everything, local news cameras whirred, capturing the moment when the Iron Serpents realized they'd been outmaneuvered. Marcus could see the calculations running behind Rodriguez's eyes, looking for an escape route, weighing options, probably counting on corrupt officials to intervene. Federal agents, Martinez announced, his voice carrying across the courthouse plaza. We have warrants for the arrest of Victor Rodriguez and 13 other named members of the Iron Serpents Motorcycle Club on charges of racketeering, corruption of public officials, and organized criminal activity. The tension in the air was electric. Marcus knew this was the most dangerous moment, when cornered predators often struck hardest. He wasn't surprised when one of the larger bikers suddenly shoved a federal agent, creating chaos as planned. "Now!" Rodriguez barked, and the Iron Serpents exploded into action. But Marcus had anticipated this too. As the bikers charged toward their motorcycles, they found their escape routes blocked by police cruisers that had silently moved into position. The veterans in the crowd, who had seemed like ordinary citizens, suddenly formed a coordinated barrier, their military training evident in their positioning. "You really should have done better research on our town," Marcus said, moving with practiced efficiency as two bikers rushed him. His Marine combat training took over, and in seconds both men were on the ground, their faces pressed into the courthouse steps. "We've got 3 VFW posts and more combat veterans than any county in the state." Rodriguez made a break for his SUV, but found his path blocked by Mrs. Chen's sons and their friends, the local high school wrestling team, who had volunteered specifically for this moment. The gang leader reached into his jacket, but before he could draw whatever weapon he was carrying, Marcus closed the distance between them. "Bad idea," Marcus warned, his voice low and dangerous. "You're already facing federal charges. Don't add armed assault to the list." "You don't understand what you're doing," Rodriguez hissed. "We have judges, politicians, police chiefs in our pocket. This won't stick." Marcus smiled grimly. "Actually, we do understand. Every bribe, every corrupt official, every illegal deal. It's all documented. Your pet health inspectors turned out to be quite chatty when faced with federal charges. And those weren't just security cameras recording your activities these past few months. The FBI is very interested in your operation." Around them, federal agents and honest local cops were putting Iron Serpents members in handcuffs. The crowd had grown even larger, citizens recording everything on their phones, ensuring that no detail of the gang's downfall would be missed or covered up. Bill Johnson pushed through the crowd, standing tall for the first time since Marcus had known him. "We're not afraid anymore," the hardware store owner declared. "You can't threaten an entire community when it stands together." Officer Chen approached, reading from her tablet. "Sir, we've got reports of simultaneous raids at the Iron Serpents clubhouse and 3 other properties. State police just arrested 2 county officials trying to flee the jurisdiction." Marcus watched as Carlos Martinez personally cuffed Rodriguez. "You know what your biggest mistake was?" Marcus asked the gang leader. "You thought you were just fighting one old Marine, but you were really fighting a community that just needed someone to show them how to stand together." As federal agents led Rodriguez away, Marcus surveyed the scene. The courthouse steps, where moments ago the Iron Serpents had stood in intimidating force, were now occupied by citizens. Business owners, families, veterans, all standing together. The fear that had gripped the town was dissolving in the bright midday sun. Mike Sullivan limped over, his black eye now a badge of honor. "Just like old times, eh?" "Though usually our operations involved more explosions and less paperwork," Marcus laughed. "The paperwork's what makes it stick. By the time the federal prosecutors are done, the Iron Serpents won't be threatening anyone for a very long time." But as he watched Rodriguez being driven away in a federal vehicle, Marcus knew that their victory, while significant, was just the beginning. Corruption had deep roots, and there would be others who would try to fill the power vacuum left by the Iron Serpent's fall. That was fine by him. After all, Marines were taught to be always faithful, not just to their corps, but to their communities. And Marcus Reeves was just getting started. The days following the Iron Serpent's downfall brought changes no one had expected. Marcus watched from his usual spot in Sullivan's diner as news vans crowded the streets, their reporters eager to cover the story of how a small town had stood up to organized crime. But the real transformation was happening in quieter ways, visible in the confident stride of shopkeepers who no longer looked over their shoulders, in the laughter of children playing freely in the streets again. "Channel 7 wants to interview you," Officer Chen said, sliding into the booth across from Marcus with a fresh cup of coffee. "They're calling you the hardware store hero." She smiled at his grimace. "Don't worry, I told them you're not interested." "Good," Marcus replied, watching Mrs. Chen directing workers as they installed new windows in her flower shop. Heroes aren't what we need right now. We need community. The federal investigation was expanding like ripples in a pond. Each day brought new revelations, new arrests. 3 judges had resigned. The police chief was under investigation. Even the mayor was facing questions about his connections to the Iron Serpent's legitimate business fronts. Carlos says they're finding links to criminal organizations in 4 states, Officer Chen reported, her voice low despite the diner's morning bustle. The Iron Serpents were just the visible part of something much bigger. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. That's how these operations work. Like an iceberg, most of the danger is hidden below the surface. He watched as Bill Johnson's hardware store truck drove past, loaded with supplies for repairs around town. The old man had organized a volunteer effort to fix the damage from the gang's retaliation. Mike Sullivan limped over, coffee pot in hand. Speaking of hidden dangers, the diner owner said, topping off their cups, word is some of Rodriguez's old partners aren't happy about losing their investment opportunities here. My contacts at the VFW say there's chatter about outside interests looking to move in. Let them try, Marcus replied calmly. They'll find a different town than the one the Iron Serpents tried to intimidate. He gestured around the diner, where business owners, who had once avoided eye contact, now sat together, planning and laughing. Fear only works when people feel alone. His phone buzzed, a text from Tommy, his nephew. Uncle Marcus, you need to see this. Community center meeting. Something good. 20 minutes later, Marcus stood in the back of the old community center, watching as residents packed the main hall. Bill Johnson was at the podium, his voice stronger than Marcus had ever heard it. For too long, we let fear divide us, the hardware store owner was saying. But recent events have shown us what we can accomplish together. That's why we're proposing the formation of a permanent community watch council. Not just to prevent crime, but to foster the connections that make a town strong. Mrs. Chen stood up, reading from prepared notes. We've already received pledges from 30 business owners to fund youth programs, job training, and emergency assistance for families in need. The money we once paid in protection will now protect our community's future. Marcus felt a presence beside him and turned to find Carlos Martinez, still in his federal agent suit. Impressive, his old war buddy commented quietly. Most towns, after we remove organized crime, they just return to their old patterns. But this... He gestured at the energy in the room. This is different. Because they're not just reacting to crime, Marcus explained. They're building something. Community isn't just about standing together against threats. It's about creating connections that prevent those threats from taking root. The meeting continued, with residents proposing initiatives. Security cameras that uploaded to a community-monitored network, a system for businesses to alert each other about suspicious activities, programs to help at-risk youth avoid the lure of gangs. But it was more than just security measures. They were planning street festivals, community gardens, mentorship programs. You know, Officer Chen said, joining them at the back, the department's creating a new community liaison position. They want to repair trust after everything that happened. I'm thinking of applying. Marcus smiled. They'd be lucky to have you. A police force is only as effective as its connection to the community it serves. As the meeting wound down, Bill Johnson approached them, his face flushed with excitement. Marcus, we want you to head the Community Watch Council. Your experience, your leadership. We need someone who understands both security and community building. Marcus was about to decline to explain that he'd done his part, but something stopped him. He looked around the room, saw the hope in people's faces, the determination to build something lasting from the ashes of fear. On one condition, he said finally, we focus on prevention, not reaction, on building bridges, not walls. The best way to stop criminals from taking over a community is to make that community too strong to take. Later that evening, as Marcus sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on how a simple trip to buy power tools had led to such profound changes. His phone buzzed with a news alert. The state attorney general was announcing a broader investigation into corruption, using evidence gathered from the Iron Serpents case. A motorcycle rumbled past, and Marcus noticed something telling. Nobody flinched, Nobody looked away in fear. The town had changed, not just in its surface peace, but in its deep-rooted confidence. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest victories weren't won through dramatic confrontations, but through the quiet courage of people standing together, day after day, building something stronger than fear. The war veteran in him knew there would be other threats, other battles. But the community builder in him knew that this time, they were ready, not just with fists and courage, but with unity and purpose. 3 months after the Iron Serpent's fall, Marcus stood in the newly renovated hardware store, watching as Bill Johnson taught a group of teenagers the basics of woodworking. The free weekend workshops had been the old man's idea, a way to give local kids something constructive to focus on. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that the same space where he'd first confronted the bikers was now being used to prevent young people from following similar paths. "Keep that angle steady, Tommy," Bill instructed Marcus's nephew, who was helping a younger boy with a saw. "Precision matters in craftsmanship, just like it matters in life." Marcus smiled, remembering similar lessons from his father's workshop. The skills he'd learned there had served him well in the Marines, though not in ways his father could have imagined. Now those same skills were helping build something more important than furniture. They were building community. His phone buzzed with a text from Carlos Martinez. "Final sentencing today. Rodriguez got 20 years, 14 corrupt officials. Going down with him. You started something big, brother." The federal investigation had expanded far beyond their small town, uncovering a network of corruption that spanned 3 states. But Marcus was more interested in the local changes. Officer Chen, now officially the department's community liaison, had implemented programs that were becoming models for other towns. Crime rates had dropped, not through force, but through connection. "Marcus," Mrs. Chen called out as he left the hardware store. Her flower shop was thriving, its windows now decorated with children's artwork. "Don't forget the community dinner tonight, my boys are cooking." The monthly community dinners had become a town tradition, held in the renovated community center. Different families took turns preparing meals, sharing their cultures and stories. Tonight would mark 3 months since their stand against the Iron Serpents, though few people talked about that anymore. They were too busy building the future. Mike Sullivan's Diner had become an unofficial command center for the Community Watch Council, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of focusing on threats, they organized youth programs, job fairs, and support for struggling families. The veterans who had stood ready to fight that day at the courthouse now taught leadership courses to local teenagers. "You know what the best part is," Sullivan said as Marcus settled into his usual booth. "Haven't had to throw a single punch since that day. Turns out when people feel connected to their community, they tend to protect it themselves." Marcus nodded, remembering countless counterinsurgency operations overseas. "That's what we learned in the Corps. You can't just fight the enemy, you have to build something worth defending." The bell above the diner door chimed, and Tommy rushed in, still wearing his workshop apron. "Uncle Marcus, you've got to see this." He thrust a tablet toward Marcus, showing a news article. Other towns were adopting their community program model, creating their own versions of the Watch Council. "They're calling it the Cedar Grove method," Tommy beamed, proud of their town's new reputation. Marcus was about to respond when he noticed a group of motorcycles passing by the diner. But these weren't gang members. They were part of the local veterans riding club headed to mentor at-risk youth. The same skills that had once made them formidable in combat now served a different mission. That evening, as the community center filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, Marcus found himself standing back, observing. Bill Johnson was showing off photos of his students' woodworking projects. Mrs. Chen's sons were serving their mother's famous dumplings. Officer Chen was discussing youth programs with former troublemakers who now volunteered as mentors. "Quite a change from 3 months ago," Carlos Martinez observed, having driven down for the celebration. The federal agent looked around appreciatively. "You know, we take down criminal organizations all the time, but this is different. You didn't just stop the bad guys, you changed the environment that allowed them to thrive." Marcus watched as Tommy led a group of younger kids in setting up tables. "Sometimes the best way to fight darkness isn't with force," he replied. "It's by building something so bright that the darkness has nowhere to take hold." As the evening wound down, Marcus stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The street was peaceful, but not with the fearful silence that had once gripped it. This was the peace of security, of community, of people connected to something larger than themselves. A young boy rode past on his bicycle, waving casually to Marcus. No fear, no looking over his shoulder, just the simple joy of a child in a safe neighborhood. And that, Marcus realized, was the greatest victory of all. Not the arrests, not the sentences, not even the systemic changes, but the return of innocent moments like this. His phone buzzed one last time, a message from Bill Johnson. "Thank you for teaching us to stand together. Some battles are worth any price." Marcus smiled, tucking the phone away. The hardware store confrontation that had started it all seemed like a lifetime ago. But its lesson remained true. Sometimes the strongest weapon against evil isn't a fist or a gun, but the courage to stand together and build something worth protecting. The Marine in him knew that other threats might come, but now they would face more than just one retired veteran. They would face a community united, strong, and unafraid, and that was a force no enemy could defeat. 1 year later, Marcus stood in front of Johnson's Hardware, now expanded to include a community workshop space. The morning sun glinted off the new sign that read, "Johnson & Sons Hardware and Training Center." The sons part, including not just Bill's own children, but all the young people who had found direction through their programs. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Bill said, joining Marcus outside. The old man stood straighter now, confidence replacing the fear that had once haunted his eyes. "Remember when all we were worried about was selling power tools?" Marcus chuckled, watching as Tommy led a group of students into the workshop area. His nephew had discovered a talent for teaching, turning his own past struggles into lessons that resonated with troubled youth. The sound of saws and hammers drifted through the open doors, the tools that had once been potential weapons now building futures. His phone buzzed with a news alert. "Final Iron Serpents associate sentenced, criminal network fully dismantled." The article mentioned Cedar Grove as the catalyst that had brought down a multi-state criminal enterprise. But Marcus was more interested in the local paper's headline. "Community Center expands youth programs. Waiting list shows high demand." "Marcus," Officer Chen called out, pulling up in her patrol car. Now a full lieutenant, she had transformed the department's community engagement program. "Got some interesting visitors at the station. FBI's sending people to study our community model. They want to implement it nationally." The changes in Cedar Grove had caught the attention of law enforcement agencies across the country. What had started as a confrontation in a hardware store had evolved into a template for community-based crime prevention. Other towns facing similar challenges had sent representatives to learn their methods. "Uncle Marcus." Tommy rushed out of the workshop, excitement in his voice. "The Veterans Mentorship Program just got approved for federal funding. We can expand to 10 more schools." The program, which paired troubled teens with combat veterans, had shown remarkable success. The same skills that had made them effective warriors, discipline, leadership, teamwork, now shaped young lives. Even some former Iron Serpents members who had served in the military had joined after their release, choosing redemption over revenge. Mike Sullivan's diner was packed as usual for the weekly community meeting. What had started as a crisis response had become a forum for positive change. Today's agenda included plans for a new youth sports complex, built on land that had once housed the Iron Serpents clubhouse. "You know what I love most?" Sullivan said, refilling Marcus's coffee cup. "The quiet. Not the scared quiet from before, but the peace that comes from knowing your community has your back." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what his fellow veteran meant. It was the same peace they'd tried to build in war-torn countries, the kind that came from the ground up, from people investing in their community's future. Carlos Martinez visited occasionally, bringing news of how their model was being implemented elsewhere. "You've started something bigger than you know," he told Marcus during his last visit. "Communities across the country are learning that strength comes from unity, not fear. As evening approached, Marcus walked through the town square, now bustling with families enjoying the weekly market. Street musicians played while children darted between stalls selling local crafts, many made in Johnson's workshop programs. The scene was worlds away from the tense standoff that had taken place here a year ago. Mrs. Chen waved from her flower shop, where she now offered horticultural therapy programs for veterans with PTSD. Next door, the auto parts store had become a training center for young mechanics. Every business that had once paid protection money now invested in protection of a different kind, protecting their community's future. A motorcycle rumbled past, and Marcus smiled at how normal it seemed now. The Veterans Riding Club had reclaimed the roads, their leather vests bearing patches of service and honor rather than intimidation. They mentored young riders, teaching them that freedom came with responsibility. Back at the hardware store, Marcus found Bill closing up for the day. The old man was holding a framed photo, the security camera still from that first confrontation, now hung behind the counter as a reminder. "You know what's funny?" Bill mused. "They thought they were so powerful with their threats and violence, but real power." He gestured to the workshop where young people learned trades, to the community board filled with success stories, to the streets outside where people walked without fear. Real power is what we built here. Marcus understood. In the Marines, they'd learned that true victory wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about building something worth protecting. Cedar Grove had become more than just a town that stood up to criminals. It had become a blueprint for how communities could transform themselves. As darkness fell, Marcus sat on his porch, listening to the sounds of his neighborhood. Children playing, families chatting, the occasional friendly honk of passing cars, the ordinary music of a community at peace with itself. His phone buzzed one last time, a message from a Marine buddy sharing news of another town adopting their program. The hardware store confrontation that had started it all was now just a story people told, but its lessons lived on. Sometimes the bravest thing wasn't standing up to fight, but standing together to build. And sometimes the most powerful weapon against darkness wasn't force at all. It was the light of a community united in purpose and hope. Marcus smiled, knowing that while the battle that began in a hardware store was over, its victory continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond their small town. That was the thing about real change. It didn't end with the last punch thrown or the final arrest made. It lived on in every life transformed, every community strengthened, every future brightened, and that was worth more than any war he'd ever fought. 5 years after the confrontation at Johnson's Hardware, Marcus Reeves found himself standing in front of a packed auditorium at the National Law Enforcement Conference in Washington, D.C. The same quiet confidence that had once faced down 7 bikers now commanded the attention of police chiefs, federal agents, and community leaders from across the country. "The Cedar Grove method isn't about fighting crime," Marcus explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "It's about preventing the conditions that allow crime to take root. When we stood up to the Iron Serpents, we weren't just confronting a gang. We were challenging the idea that communities are powerless against organized crime." In the front row, Carlos Martinez nodded approvingly. Now the director of the FBI's Community Engagement Division, he had helped spread the Cedar Grove model nationwide. Next to him sat Officer, now Police Chief, Chen, whose innovative programs had become a blueprint for departments across the country. "You want statistics?" Marcus continued, clicking through his presentation. "In the 5 years since implementing our program, over 300 communities have adopted the Cedar Grove method. Organized crime dropped by 60% in participating areas, youth gang recruitment down 70%, but the numbers don't tell the real story." He switched to a photo of Johnson's Hardware, now a bustling community hub with 3 locations across the state. The workshop program had expanded into a fully accredited trade school, offering hope and skills to young people who might otherwise have been drawn into crime. "The real story is about transformation," Marcus said, sharing images of communities that had followed Cedar Grove's example. In Detroit, former gang territories are now community gardens. In Los Angeles, ex-gang members mentor at-risk youth. In Chicago, motorcycle clubs that once terrorized neighborhoods now organized charity rides for children's hospitals. His phone buzzed, a message from Tommy, who now ran the original hardware store while Bill Johnson focused on expanding their youth programs. Uncle Marcus just got approved for federal funding to open 5 more training centers. The waiting list is 6 months long. After the presentation, Marcus found himself surrounded by officials eager to implement similar programs in their communities. But his attention was drawn to a small group waiting patiently at the edge of the crowd. Former Iron Serpents members who had served their time and chosen a different path. "Your story changed us," their spokesman said. The snake tattoo on his neck, now covered by a Marine Corps emblem, made us realize we were fighting for the wrong things. Now we're helping other guys coming out of prison find a better way. Back in Cedar Grove that evening, Marcus walked the familiar streets of his hometown. The physical changes were obvious: renovated buildings, new businesses, packed community centers. But the real transformation was in the people. Children played freely, neighbors chatted on porches, and the once fearful silence had been replaced by the confident buzz of a thriving community. Mike Sullivan's diner had become a chain, each location doubling as a veteran-run community center. "Who'd have thought?" Sullivan laughed, serving Marcus his usual coffee. "A bunch of old war dogs would end up fighting our most important battle right here at home." The Community Watch Council, once formed to combat the Iron Serpents, had evolved into a national organization providing resources and guidance to towns facing similar challenges. Mrs. Chen's Flower Shop Therapy program was now part of the VA's official PTSD treatment options, with branches opening near military bases across the country. "You know what's really remarkable?" Bill Johnson said, joining Marcus for their weekly planning meeting. "We're not just stopping crime. We're changing how people think about community. Every person who walks through our doors isn't just learning a trade. They're learning they belong somewhere." The hardware store workshop hummed with activity as usual. But among the students learning woodworking and mechanical skills, Marcus noticed something powerful. Former gang members working alongside retired police officers, troubled teens mentoring younger kids, past enemies finding common ground in creation rather than destruction. His phone lit up with another message, this time from a Marine buddy stationed overseas. "Just watched your conference speech, implementing Cedar Grove method in our reconstruction efforts here. It works, brother. Different country, same principles." As darkness fell over Cedar Grove, Marcus stood in the spot where he'd first confronted the Iron Serpents 5 years ago. The lessons learned that day had rippled out far beyond their small town, touching lives across the nation and even overseas. What had started as a simple act of standing up to bullies had become a movement about standing together. "Some battles change more than just the battlefield," he murmured, watching families stroll past the hardware store's evening workshops. The same skills that had made him an effective warrior had helped build something far more powerful than any weapon: hope. A group of motorcycles rumbled past, the local Veterans Riding Club escorting at-risk youth to a mentorship program. The sound no longer brought fear but pride. Pride in how far they'd come, in what they'd built, in what they'd inspired others to build. Because in the end, the greatest victory wasn't just about one retired Marine standing up to 7 bikers in a hardware store. It was about showing the world that when communities stand together, no force of darkness can prevail against the light of unity, purpose, and hope. And that was a lesson worth any price. 10 years after that fateful day at Johnson's Hardware, Marcus Reeves stood in Arlington National Cemetery, paying his respects to fallen brothers. A light snow dusted the countless white headstones, and in the crisp winter air, he reflected on how a simple confrontation in a hardware store had led to a lifetime of unexpected service. Not in combat, but in community building. His phone buzzed with a message from Tommy, now the executive director of the National Community Resilience Program, an organization that had grown from Cedar Grove's example. "Uncle Marcus, just got the final numbers. 1,000 communities across all 50 states have now implemented our program. We're making a real difference." The statistics were impressive. Organized crime down by 75% in participating communities, youth gang recruitment nearly eliminated, and a new generation growing up understanding that strength came from unity, not fear. But numbers couldn't capture the real impact. The lives changed, The families restored, the communities transformed. "Quite a legacy, Master Sergeant," a voice said behind him. Marcus turned to find General Roberts, his old commanding officer, now serving as a senior advisor to the President's Task Force on Community Safety. "Who would have thought that your most important battle would be fought in a hardware store?" They walked together through the snow-covered grounds, discussing the evolution of the Cedar Grove method. What had started as a response to local intimidation had grown into a comprehensive approach to community resilience, studied in universities and implemented by governments worldwide. "The President wants to make it national policy," Roberts continued. "Mandatory implementation in every law enforcement jurisdiction. They're calling it the Reeves Initiative, though I know you'll hate that name." Marcus smiled, remembering how it all began. It was never about one person. That was the whole point. It's about showing communities their own strength. Back in Cedar Grove that evening, the town had gathered for the 10th anniversary celebration of what they now simply called The Stand. The old hardware store, though now part of a nationwide chain of community training centers, still retained its original character. Bill Johnson's grandson gave woodworking lessons where his grandfather had once faced down bikers. Mrs. Chen's flower therapy program had expanded into a national network of healing centers. Her sons, once teenage photographers documenting the confrontation, now ran a media company specializing in community empowerment stories. Their latest documentary about the Cedar Grove method had just won an Academy Award. Mike Sullivan's Diner had become a gathering place for community leaders from around the world, coming to learn the principles that had transformed a small town's resistance into a global movement. The walls were covered with photos, the original confrontation, the courthouse gathering, and countless success stories that followed. "You know what's remarkable?" Sullivan said, serving coffee to a group of visiting officials from Europe. "Every town that implements this program makes it their own. It's not just copying Cedar Grove. It's about communities discovering their own strength." Officer Chen, now Commissioner Chen of the State Police, had created a new model of law enforcement based on community engagement rather than confrontation. "We don't just respond to crime anymore," she explained to her international colleagues. "We build relationships that prevent it." The Iron Serpents were now just a cautionary tale, their former clubhouse transformed into a youth center where ex-gang members taught job skills and life lessons. Some of the original members, after serving their time, had become the program's strongest advocates, traveling the country to share their stories of transformation. Marcus's phone lit up again. A message from Carlos Martinez, now retired from the FBI but still active in community work. "Just saw the latest numbers. Remember when we thought we were just taking down one motorcycle gang? We ended up starting a revolution in community safety." As evening fell, Marcus walked through the town square, now a bustling center of community life. The same space where they had once faced down corruption was filled with families, street musicians, and young entrepreneurs running businesses started through the training program. A group of motorcycles thundered past, not gang members, but participants in the Veterans Community Ride, an annual event that had spread to hundreds of cities. They raised millions for youth programs, turning the symbol of past intimidation into a force for positive change. In the hardware store's workshop, Marcus watched as a former Iron Serpent member, his arms now covered with sleeves of positive imagery, taught a group of teenagers the art of furniture making. "The tools we once used to threaten," the man explained, "now build futures." His phone buzzed one final time. A message from Bill Johnson, now in his 80s but still passionate about their mission. "Marcus, remember when all I wanted was to sell hardware without being threatened? Look what you helped us build instead." Standing there, watching the next generation learn and grow, Marcus understood that some victories couldn't be measured in battles won or enemies defeated. The real triumph was in the countless small moments of transformation. A troubled teen finding purpose, a community discovering its voice, a nation learning that true strength comes not from force, but from unity. The hardware store confrontation that had started it all was now taught in schools as a lesson in civic courage. But the real lesson, Marcus knew, wasn't about one man standing up to bullies. It was about showing people that when they stood together, they could build something stronger than fear, more lasting than intimidation, more powerful than any threat. And that was a legacy worth everything. 20 years after the confrontation at Johnson's Hardware, Marcus Reeves sat in his favorite chair on the porch of what was now known as the Cedar Grove Community Leadership Center. Once his simple home, now expanded into a facility where community leaders from around the world came to learn. At 72, his hair had turned completely white, but his eyes still carried the same determination that had faced down 7 bikers in a hardware store 2 decades ago. Young voices drifted from the training room where Tommy, now Professor Thomas Reeves, was teaching a course on community resilience to a group of international students. The curriculum had become part of law enforcement and social work programs in universities across 6 continents. "Grandpa Marcus," a young girl's voice called out. 8-year-old Sarah, Bill Johnson's great-granddaughter, came running up the steps, clutching a school project. "Look, I got an A+ on my history report about the stand." Marcus smiled, looking at her carefully crafted presentation. The story of Cedar Grove's transformation had become required learning in schools nationwide, though he sometimes barely recognized himself in the almost mythical tales that were told. "Did you really throw a whole motorcycle gang out of the hardware store by yourself?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Before Marcus could answer, a deep laugh came from behind them. "He had help, little one," Mike Sullivan Jr. said, walking up with his father. The younger Sullivan now ran a nationwide chain of community diners, each one a hub for local organization and support. Though your grandpa Marcus was pretty impressive that day. His phone buzzed. A message from the White House. The president was requesting his presence at the signing of the Global Community Resilience Act legislation that would implement Cedar Grove-inspired programs in partnership with the United Nations. What had started in a small-town hardware store had truly gone global. "Tell me again about Mrs. Chen's flowers," Sarah pleaded, settling into her favorite story-listening spot on the porch steps. The old flower shop owner had passed away 5 years ago, but her legacy lived on in the thousands of therapy gardens that now bloomed outside VA hospitals and community centers worldwide. "Well," Marcus began, his voice carrying the weight of years of storytelling, "Mrs. Chen taught us something important, that healing doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from creating beauty in places where there was once fear." The sound of motorcycles drew their attention. The annual Cedar Grove Youth Ride was beginning. Hundreds of young riders, mentored by veterans and former gang members, were setting out on a cross-country journey to establish new community programs in struggling towns. Hard to believe there was a time when that sound meant trouble, the elder Sullivan mused, now walking with a cane but still sharp as ever. Now, it's the sound of hope arriving. Marcus's phone lit up again. Commissioner Tommy Chen, Officer Chen's son, was sending updates about the latest expansion of their program. Police academies worldwide now required training in the Cedar Grove method, transforming law enforcement from a force of control to a force for community empowerment. Inside the Leadership Center, the walls told the story of their journey. Photos, news clippings, testimonials from communities that had followed Cedar Grove's example. But among all the accolades and achievements, Marcus's favorite remained a simple security camera, still from that first day, showing 7 bikers learning a lesson about respect and community. "You know what's remarkable?" a voice said. Marcus turned to find Carlos Martinez's daughter, Maria, now the FBI's Director of Community Transformation. Other towns faced similar threats, some even fought back. But only Cedar Grove turned resistance into renaissance. The hardware store still stood, though it had evolved into something far more than its founders could have imagined. The Johnson Family Community Trade School, as it was now known, had campuses in 50 states and 12 countries. Each one maintained the original philosophy, that tools meant for building should never be used for destruction. Sarah tugged at Marcus's sleeve. "Is it true that bad people don't come here anymore because they're scared of you, Grandpa Marcus?" Marcus shook his head, using this teachable moment as he had countless times before. "They don't come here because there's no room for darkness where there's this much light. When people stand together, when they build something meaningful together, it leaves no space for those who would destroy." As evening approached, the Leadership Center filled with familiar faces. Children and grandchildren of those who had stood together that day 20 years ago. They gathered for their weekly community dinner, a tradition that had never faded. Looking out over the generations gathered there, Marcus reflected on how a moment of standing up to bullies had sparked something far beyond himself. The true victory wasn't in the confrontation or even in the changes that followed. It was in the faces of young people like Sarah, growing up in a world where community meant strength, where standing together was natural as breathing. His phone buzzed one last time, a message from a Marine unit overseas, implementing the Cedar Grove method in a war-torn village. "It works, sir, just like you said. When people discover their collective strength, peace isn't just possible, it's inevitable." Marcus smiled, watching Sarah teach younger children the community pledge they'd developed over the years. The hardware store confrontation that had started it all was now just one chapter in a much larger story. A story of how one community's courage had helped change the world. And that story was still being written, one generation at a time. 25 years after the confrontation that changed everything, Cedar Grove prepared for a momentous occasion. The town square, once a battlefield of intimidation, was now being dedicated as the National Center for Community Resilience. At its heart stood the Eternal Flame Memorial, symbolizing the undying spirit of communities standing together against darkness. Marcus Reeves, now in his late 70s, sat in a wheelchair at the center of the stage, though he insisted he could still stand. Around him gathered faces both old and new, 3 generations of people whose lives had been touched by the movement that started in a hardware store. "Grandpa," Sarah whispered, now a confident 13-year-old who led youth programs across the state. "They want you to light the flame." Before the ceremony could begin, a rumble of motorcycles filled the air. But unlike that day 25 years ago, these riders came in peace, thousands of them, representing community programs from all 50 states. Leading them was Tommy, now gray at the temples himself, carrying the torch that would light the eternal flame. "Ladies and gentlemen," the current mayor announced, 25 years ago, a single act of courage in a hardware store sparked a revolution in how communities protect and strengthen themselves. Today, we honor not just that moment, but all the moments of transformation that followed. Marcus's phone buzzed with messages from around the world, communities celebrating their own anniversaries of transformation. From the favelas of Brazil to the streets of Tokyo, the Cedar Grove method had taken root and flourished in unique ways, each culture adding its own wisdom to the foundation. Bill Johnson's great-grandson, now running the international network of trade schools, stepped to the podium. "My great-grandfather used to say that tools could build or destroy. It was all in how you use them. Today we've built something that no force of darkness can tear down." The ceremony continued as community leaders from around the world shared their stories. A former gang member from Los Angeles, who now ran youth intervention programs. A police chief from London who had revolutionized community policing. A village elder from Kenya who had used the Cedar Grove method to bring peace to warring communities. But it was Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, now a leading psychologist specializing in community trauma healing, who captured the essence of their journey. The miracle of Cedar Grove isn't just that one community stood up to intimidation. It's that they showed the world a new way to stand together. As the sun began to set, Tommy approached the Eternal Flame Memorial with the torch, but instead of lighting it himself, he knelt beside Marcus's wheelchair. "This honor belongs to you, Uncle Marcus. You showed us the way." Marcus shook his head, gesturing for Sarah to join them. "Number the future belongs to them. Let the next generation light the way forward." Together, 3 generations, Marcus steadying Sarah's hand as Tommy held the torch, lit the eternal flame. The square erupted in cheers as the fire caught, its light reflecting off the memorial's polished surface where thousands of community stories were etched. That evening, as celebrations continued across town, Marcus sat in his old spot at Sullivan's Diner, now run by the 3rd generation of the family. The walls, covered with 25 years of photographs and memories, told a story far bigger than one confrontation. "You know what I remember most about that day?" Mike Sullivan Jr. said, serving coffee to the gathered veterans. "Not the fight, not the fear, but the moment afterward when people realized they didn't have to be afraid anymore. Marcus's phone lit up one final time, a message from the president announcing the expansion of the Global Community Resilience Initiative to include every UN member nation. What had started as a stand against 7 bikers had grown into a worldwide movement for positive change. Looking around the diner, Marcus saw the living legacy of that day 25 years ago. Young people who had never known fear in their community. Former adversaries who had become partners in building something better. A new generation that understood strength came not from intimidation, but from unity. "Grandpa," Sarah said, settling into the booth beside him, "tell me again about the day it all started. Not the fight part, the part about why you decided to stand up." Marcus smiled, seeing in her eyes the same determination he'd carried into battle, both in war and peace. It was never about fighting, Sarah. It was about protecting something precious, the right of good people to live without fear. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. Outside, the eternal flame cast its steady light across the square, a beacon of hope in a world that still needed reminders of what communities could achieve together. The hardware store where it all began had become a pillar of that light, its tools still building futures, its lessons still shaping lives. And as night fell over Cedar Grove, Marcus knew that the real legacy wasn't in monuments or programs, or even the eternal flame. It was in the hearts of people like Sarah, carrying forward the understanding that true strength comes not from power over others, but from standing together for something greater than ourselves. The story that began with a confrontation in a hardware store had become a never-ending tale of human potential. A reminder that sometimes the most important battles we fight are not against enemies, but for the future we wish to build. And that future burned bright, like an eternal flame lighting the way forward. 30 years after the hardware store confrontation, Cedar Grove prepared to say goodbye to its hero. Marcus Reeves, at 82, had finally answered his last call to duty. The news spread quickly, not just through the town, but across the global network of communities he had helped inspire. The hardware store where it all began closed its doors for the first time in 50 years. Black ribbons adorned the workshop tools that had built not just furniture, but a legacy of strength and unity. Bill Johnson's great-grandson hung a simple sign, "Gone to honor a hero, the man who taught us tools build futures, not fear." Sarah, now 18 and headed to the Naval Academy, stood at her grandfather's bedside in Cedar Grove Memorial Hospital. Tommy, his hair now more gray than black, sat opposite, holding the hand of the man who had changed not just their lives, but countless others. "Uncle Marcus," Tommy said softly, "the president called. They want to name the new National Community Defense Act after you." Marcus, his voice weak but his eyes still sharp, managed to smile. "Tell them to name it after Cedar Grove instead." It was never about one person. Outside the hospital, an extraordinary sight unfolded. Thousands of motorcycles rolled silently into town. Veterans, former gang members turned mentors, community leaders from across the country. They came not with roaring engines, but in peaceful tribute, their headlights creating a river of light through the streets. "Look, Grandpa," Sarah whispered, pointing out the window. "They're all here because of you." Marcus shook his head slightly. "No, sweetheart. They're here because they discovered their own strength. We just showed them where to look for it." His phone buzzed one last time, a message from a Marine unit in a formerly war-torn village halfway across the world. "Mission accomplished, sir. The community stands together now. Your legacy lives on." The next morning, as dawn broke over Cedar Grove, Marcus Reeves passed peacefully, surrounded by 3 generations of the community he had helped build. But even in death, he had one final lesson to teach. The funeral procession that followed was unlike anything the town had seen. The hardware store tools, polished to a shine, were carried by apprentices from the trade school. Mrs. Chen's grandchildren scattered flowers grown in the therapy gardens their grandmother had started. Police officers from across the nation stood at attention, their badges bearing the Cedar Grove Method shield. But it was the gathering at the community center that truly captured Marcus's legacy. People from every walk of life, former adversaries, reformed criminals, community leaders, and ordinary citizens, came together not in sorrow, but in celebration of a life that had shown them a better way. "My grandfather," Sarah spoke from the podium, her voice strong despite her tears, "always said that the true measure of strength isn't in how hard you can fight, but in how well you can build. He didn't just help us stand up to bullies, he helped us stand up for each other." Tommy followed with stories from the early days, making the gathered crowd laugh through their tears with tales of Marcus's unwavering determination. "He turned a simple trip to buy power tools into a revolution in community building," Tommy concluded, "but he never wanted credit. He just wanted change." The eternal flame in the town square burned especially bright that day, its light catching the tears on faces young and old. But among the mourners, something remarkable was happening. New connections being formed, new promises being made, new torchbearers stepping forward to carry on the work. Commissioner Tommy Chen announced the establishment of the Marcus Reeves Fellowship for Community Policing. Mike Sullivan's grandchildren unveiled plans for a nationwide network of community dinner programs. The hardware store apprentices committed to opening new training centers in underserved areas. As evening fell, Sarah stood in the old hardware store, running her hands over the workbench where it all began. A simple plaque now marked the spot where her grandfather had first taken a stand. "Here, one Marine showed us that the strongest weapons against darkness are unity, courage, and hope." Her phone buzzed with messages from around the world, communities sharing how the Cedar Grove method had transformed their lives. From inner-city neighborhoods to rural towns, from war-torn regions to peaceful suburbs, Marcus's legacy lived on in every place where people stood together against fear. "You know what he'd say right now?" Tommy said, joining her at the workbench. "He'd tell us to stop mourning and get back to building." Sarah smiled through her tears, picking up a hammer, the same one that had fallen during that first confrontation 30 years ago. "Then let's build something worthy of his memory." Outside, the eternal flame continued its vigil, casting light on a community forever changed by one Marine's courage and wisdom. The story that began with a confrontation in a hardware store had become a testament to the enduring power of unity, the strength of community, and the truth that some legacies never die. Marcus Reeves had fought his last battle, but the army of light he had inspired continued to grow, spreading hope and strength to communities around the world. And in that way, the Marine who had taught a town to stand together would never truly be gone. His spirit lived on in every community that chose unity over fear, in every person who stood up for what was right, and in every tool used to build a better future. The hardware store lights dimmed for the night, but the light of his legacy burned on, eternal, unquenchable, and ever-growing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.